The first time Samuel Harrison saw her, he thought the devil himself had sent a warrior to claim his soul. A wild Lakota girl thundering down from Devil's Ridge on a black stallion, her war cry echoing across the Montana plains like judgment day, screaming to anyone who'd listen that she bowed to no man, no law, and no God, except the one that made her free. It was high noon on September 15th, 1887, and the autumn sun blazed mercilessly over Harrison's trading post, a ramshackle collection of weathered buildings squatting like tumbleweeds against the endless prairie. Samuel had been inventory counting behind the counter, sweat beading on his weathered forehead as he tallied canned goods and ammunition when the thunder began. Not the rolling thunder of storm clouds, but something more primal, more deliberate. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against hard-packed earth, growing louder with each passing second. Samuel dropped his pencil and moved to the window, his hand instinctively finding the Colt revolver at his hip. In 43 years of frontier life, he'd learned to distinguish between the sounds that meant opportunity and the sounds that meant death was riding your way. What he saw through the dust-caked glass made his blood freeze in his veins. A rider approached from the north, silhouetted against the burning sky like an apparition from the old Apache wars. But this wasn't any ordinary rider. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the flowing black hair streaming behind like a battle banner, the bronze skin gleaming with sweat and war paint, and most unsettling of all, the complete absence of saddle or bridle on the massive black stallion that carried its rider like they were born as one creature. The horse was magnificent and terrifying, easily 17 hands high, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the sunlight around it. Its muscles rippled beneath its hide as it galloped, and Samuel could see foam at its mouth, not from exhaustion, but from pure, barely contained wildness. The stallion's eyes blazed with intelligence and fury, and as it drew closer, Samuel realized, with growing dread, that this was no tamed mount. This was a creature that had never felt the bite of a bit or the weight of civilization's expectations. But it was the rider who truly stole Samuel's breath. A young woman, no more than 17 or 18, rode the stallion with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. Her legs gripped the horse's bare flanks with perfect balance, her spine straight as a rifle barrel, her head held high with the unmistakable bearing of royalty. She wore buckskins that had been crafted with exquisite care, intricate beadwork, in patterns Samuel didn't recognize, feathers woven into her hair and paint streaked across her face in diagonal lines that marked her as a warrior. As the rider and horse thundered into the trading post's dusty yard, Samuel heard her voice for the first time, a sound that would haunt his dreams for months to come. She threw back her head and released a cry that was part war whoop, part declaration of independence, and part challenge to every soul within 10 miles. The sound cut through the afternoon air like a cavalry saber, sharp and clean and utterly without compromise. "I am Zaltana Iron Will," she shouted in English that was perfect despite carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue. "Daughter of the high mountains, rider of the black wind, keeper of promises made to no man, I answer to no master, bow to no flag, and fear no weapon forged by pale hands or dark ones." The black stallion reared up on its hind legs, front hooves pawing at the air like it was challenging the sky itself to a fight. Zaltana remained perfectly balanced during the display, her arms spread wide as if embracing the entire world, her face turned toward heaven with an expression of pure, defiant joy. For a moment, horse and rider were frozen in time, a living sculpture of rebellion against everything the frontier represented. Samuel stepped out onto his porch, his hand still resting on his gun butt, but making no move to draw the weapon. Something about this girl's presence commanded respect rather than fear. though he couldn't quite put his finger on what that something was. Her eyes, when they fixed on him, were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, gray and green and dangerous as a mountain avalanche. "You're on American territory," Samuel called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is a lawful trading post operating under territorial charter. State your business or move along." Zaltana's laugh was like silver bells being rung by a hurricane. "American territory." She gestured broadly at the endless prairie that stretched to every horizon. "This land belonged to my grandmother's grandmother before your kind learned to cross the great waters. Your papers and your charters mean nothing to the grass and the sky." The black stallion snorted and stamped, its hooves raising small clouds of dust that glittered in the afternoon sunlight. Samuel noticed that the horse bore no brands, no marks of ownership whatsoever. Its mane and tail flowed like liquid midnight, and when it tossed its head, Samuel caught glimpse of eyes that held the same fierce intelligence as its rider. "Where did you come from?" Samuel asked, genuine curiosity overriding his caution. In all his years on the frontier, he'd never seen anything quite like this girl and her magnificent horse. The nearest Lakota reservation was 3 days' hard ride to the east, and the military kept strict control over who came and went from those designated areas. Zaltana's expression shifted, becoming more guarded but no less proud. "I come from the place where the morning star touches the earth," she said, which Samuel recognized as a traditional non-answer. "I ride where the wind carries me, and today it carries me here." Samuel studied her more carefully now, taking in details that his initial shock had caused him to miss. Her buckskins were travel-worn but well-maintained, suggesting she'd been on the trail for some time but wasn't destitute. The beadwork on her clothing was intricate and beautiful, indicating both skill and access to materials. Most tellingly, she carried weapons, a Winchester rifle slung across her back, a bone-handled knife at her hip, and what looked like a traditional war club hanging from a leather thong around her wrist. "You're a long way from any reservation," Samuel observed carefully. "The territorial authorities don't take kindly to unregistered Indians traveling without passes." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees. Zaltana's eyes flashed with something that made Samuel take an involuntary step backward. "Registration." Her voice was silk wrapped around a razor blade. "Passes? You speak as if I were livestock to be counted and penned." She dismounted with liquid grace, her feet touching the ground so lightly that she barely raised dust. Standing beside the massive stallion, she seemed both dwarfed by its size and somehow perfectly matched to its power. Samuel realized that she was taller than he'd initially thought, perhaps 5.5 feet, and built like a willow branch, all lean strength and fluid motion. "I am not livestock," Zaltana continued, her hand resting casually on the knife. At her hip, "I am not property to be registered or moved, according to the whims of distant men in distant offices. I'm Lakota, daughter of the Oglala, granddaughter of warriors who rode these plains when your ancestors were still scratching in European dirt." Samuel felt sweat gathering between his shoulder blades, despite the cooling afternoon air. This girl was dangerous. Not because she was armed, though she clearly knew how to use her weapons, but because she carried herself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in her life bowed to authority she didn't choose to respect. "The law is the law," Samuel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Doesn't matter what any of us think about it." "Whose law?" Zaltana asked, tilting her head like a hawk examining prey. "The law that says my people must live on parcels of land barely large enough to graze a white man's cattle. The law that forbids us to speak our own languages, practice our own ceremonies, raise our own children according to our own ways." Samuel had no answer for that. He'd seen enough of reservation life to know that the girl spoke truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be for a law-abiding territorial citizen to acknowledge. Zaltana seemed to sense his internal struggle. Her expression softened slightly, though her posture remained alert and ready for trouble. "I do not come seeking conflict, Samuel Harrison," she said, and Samuel started at hearing his name spoken by someone he'd never met. "I come seeking supplies and information. Nothing more." "How do you know my name?" "The wind carries many messages to those who know how to listen," she replied, which Samuel took to mean she'd made inquiries about his trading post before riding in. "Your reputation for fair dealing extends beyond the boundaries your people have drawn on their maps." Despite himself, Samuel felt a flush of pride. He'd worked hard to build a reputation for honest commerce in a territory where cheating customers was often easier than treating them fairly. "What kind of supplies?" he asked, professional interest overriding his nervousness. Zaltana reached into a leather pouch at her waist and produced a small bundle of furs, beaver pelts. Samuel realized prime quality and expertly prepared. "I trade these for ammunition, dried meat and salt," she said. "Also, I need news of the eastern trails." Samuel examined the furs with an expert eye. They were indeed premium quality, worth considerably more than the supplies she was requesting. "These are fine pelts," he said honestly. "Where did you trap them?" "In places your maps do not name," Zaltana replied. "In the high country where the rivers begin and the eagles nest." Samuel nodded, understanding that she wouldn't be more specific about her trapping grounds. That was common sense on the frontier. Good hunting and trapping locations were guarded secrets, sometimes defended with violence. "I can provide what you need," Samuel said, making his decision. "But I have to warn you, there's been increased military activity in this area. Patrols looking for reservation jumpers and renegade bands. You'd be safer traveling at night and staying off the main trails." Zaltana's expression grew thoughtful. "These patrols, do they seek anyone in particular?" Samuel hesitated, then decided honesty was the wisest course. "There's been talk of a young Lakota woman causing trouble at various settlements. Someone matching your description, actually. Riding a black horse, refusing to register with the territorial authorities, trading outside the reservation system." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. The black stallion seemed to sense its rider's tension, stamping and snorting with increasing agitation. Zaltana's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to her knife handle. "And what does this talk say about such a woman?" she asked carefully. Samuel chose his words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. "Some folks call her a troublemaker. Others say she's just trying to live free, depends on who's doing the talking." Zaltana studied his face for a long moment, as if reading something written there in a language only she understood. Finally, she nodded once. "And what do you say, Samuel Harrison?" Samuel thought about the question, really thought about it. He thought about the reservation system, about the young Lakota men and women he'd seen stripped of their traditional ways and forced into the grey uniformity of federal supervision. He thought about freedom, about what it meant to live according to your own choices, rather than someone else's rules. He thought about his own reasons for coming west, his own desire to escape the suffocating expectations of civilized society. "I say," he said finally, "that every person has the right to make their own choices about how to live. Long as they're not hurting anybody else, their business is their own." Something shifted in Zaltana's expression. Not quite a smile, but a subtle relaxation of the wariness she'd carried since dismounting. "You speak wisdom, trader," she said. "Perhaps we can do business after all." As Samuel gathered the supplies she'd requested, he found himself stealing glances at this remarkable young woman. She stood beside her stallion with perfect ease, one hand resting on the horse's neck, speaking to the animal in low, melodic Lakota that seemed to calm its restless energy. There was something almost supernatural about the connection between horse and rider, as if they shared thoughts, intentions, even emotions. "That's quite a horse," Samuel commented as he wrapped the dried meat in oiled cloth. "Don't see many like him." Zaltana's face brightened with genuine warmth for the first time since her arrival. "Tokala is more than a horse," she said, using what Samuel assumed was the stallion's name. "He is my brother, my guardian, my wings, when I need to touch the sky." "Tokala, it means fox in my language," Zaltana explained, running her fingers through the stallion's mane. "When he was a colt, he was clever and quick, always escaping from wherever we tried to keep him contained. The name suited him then, and it suits him now." Samuel watched the interaction between girl and horse, noting the complete absence of fear on either side. The stallion, which had seemed barely controlled moments before, now stood quietly under Zaltana's touch, occasionally nuzzling her shoulder with obvious affection. "How long have you had him?" Samuel asked. "We found each other when we were both young," Zaltana said, which wasn't exactly an answer, but conveyed more meaning than a simple chronology would have. "He was running wild in the high country, and I was running from those who would cage my spirit. We recognized kindred souls in each other." Samuel finished packaging her supplies and calculated a fair price. The furs she'd offered were worth considerably more than what she was purchasing, which put him in an ethical dilemma. Cheating customers was bad for business in the long term, but he also couldn't afford to give away merchandise. "These pelts are worth more than what you're buying," he said finally. "I can give you credit for the difference, or add more supplies to make the trade even." Zaltana looked genuinely surprised by his honesty. "You would cheat yourself rather than cheat me." "Fair dealing is the only currency that matters out here," Samuel replied. "Cheat a customer once, and word spreads faster than prairie fire. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "something tells me you'd make a dangerous enemy." Zaltana laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound she'd made since arriving. "You read people well, Samuel Harrison." "Very well. I accept your offer of additional supplies. Tobacco, if you have it, and perhaps some of those colorful ribbons in your display case." As Samuel gathered the additional items, he found himself curious about this remarkable young woman's story. Where had she come from? How had she learned to speak English so well? What was she running from, and where was she planning to go? "The ribbons are for trade," he asked, making conversation as he worked. "For my hair," Zaltana said simply. "A warrior should look fierce in battle, but a woman should look beautiful in peace." The comment was so unexpected, so charmingly human after her dramatic arrival, that Samuel found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. "I imagine you succeed at both." Zaltana tilted her head, considering the compliment. "Beauty and fierceness are not opposites, trader. They are different faces of the same strength." Samuel finished bundling her supplies and handed them over, accepting the beaver pelts in return. As Zaltana secured the packages behind Tokala's withers, Samuel wrestled with whether to ask the question that had been nagging at him since her arrival. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. Zaltana paused in her preparations, waiting. "Why do you do it?" "Refuse to register, I mean. Refuse to follow the territorial laws. It would be easier to comply, at least officially. You could still live mostly as you choose." Zaltana was silent for so long that Samuel began to wonder if he'd overstepped some boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "My grandmother once told me a story," she said, her hands still moving among the supply bundles. "She said that when the eagles were first created, the Great Spirit offered them a choice. They could live in golden cages, safe and fed and protected from all harm, Or they could live free in the sky, facing storms and hunger and danger, but answering only to their own wings. Samuel waited, sensing there was more to the story. Most eagles, my grandmother said, chose the cages. They told themselves that freedom was too dangerous, too uncertain. Better to be safe and fed than free and struggling. Zaltana looked up at Samuel, her storm-grey eyes reflecting depths of understanding that seemed far beyond her years. But some eagles chose the sky, and those eagles, my grandmother said, those eagles remembered what it truly meant to fly. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, recognition perhaps, or envy for the clarity of her convictions. And you chose the sky. I chose the sky, Zaltana confirmed, even if it means flying alone. As she swung up onto Tokala's back with fluid grace, Samuel realized that their brief encounter had affected him more profoundly than he would have expected. This young woman, this wild daughter of the high mountains, had challenged assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making about freedom, about choice, about what it meant to live according to your own principles. Zaltana, he called as she prepared to ride out. If you ever need supplies again, or just a place to rest for a few hours, you're welcome here. I don't ask questions, and I don't report travelers to the territorial authorities. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded once. You are a good man, Samuel Harrison. The wind will remember your kindness. As horse and rider prepared to depart, Samuel felt compelled to offer one more piece of advice. Be careful out there. The military patrols are getting more aggressive, and there's talk of bringing in federal marshals specifically to deal with unregistered Indians. And Zaltana's expression grew serious. I thank you for the warning, but know this, trader, they may hunt me. They may chase me across every mile of prairie and mountain between here and the great waters, but they will never cage me. The sky is wide, and Tokala's legs are strong, and my spirit belongs to no authority but my own choosing. Martin, with that declaration, she wheeled the black stallion around and thundered out of the trading post yard, heading west toward the setting sun. Samuel watched until horse and rider disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon, leaving behind only dust and the echo of hoofbeats and the lingering sense that he had just witnessed something remarkable, something that would change the trajectory of events across the entire Montana territory. 3 days after Zaltana Ironwill vanished into the western horizon, Samuel Harrison discovered that her visit had awakened something in the Montana territory that had been sleeping for generations, something that would reshape the delicate balance between the civilized world and the wild spirits that still roamed the frontier. It began with the horses. Every horse within a 50-mile radius of Harrison's trading post had started behaving strangely. Ranch horses that had been docile for years suddenly refused to accept bridles, their eyes wild with a longing their owners couldn't understand. Cavalry mounts at Fort Mackenzie began displaying unprecedented intelligence, solving problems that should have been beyond equine capability. Most disturbing of all, several horses had simply vanished from their corrals overnight, leaving behind no trace except hoofprints that led toward the high country, a key. Samuel first became aware of the phenomenon when Martha Connolly rode into his trading post on a paint mare that was prancing and snorting with barely contained energy. Martha, the wife of a local rancher, was normally a composed woman who handled her mount with practiced ease. Today, she looked like she was riding a powder keg with a lit fuse. Samuel, I need your help, Martha called out, struggling to keep her mare under control. Buttercup's been acting crazy since Tuesday morning. Won't stand still, won't accept. The bit keeps trying to head north toward the mountains. Tom thinks maybe she ate some loco weed, but I've never seen loco weed affect a horse like this. Samuel stepped out of his store, immediately noticing the paint mare's unusual behavior. The horse's eyes were bright, with an intelligence he'd never seen in a domestic animal, and her movements had a fluid grace that reminded him uncomfortably of Tokala, Zaltana's magnificent black stallion. "When did this start exactly?" Samuel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Tuesday afternoon, right around sunset," Martha replied, confirming Samuel's growing suspicion. Tuesday had been the day Zaltana departed his trading post. "Tom's thinking about selling her if we can't get her settled down. She's got the other horses all worked up too." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. A rider was coming in fast from the east, Jake Morrison, a young cowhand who worked for the Circle Bar Ranch. Jake's horse was lathered with sweat, and the boy himself looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Harrison," Jake called out as he pulled his mount to a sliding stop. "You got to help us. Something's wrong with all the horses at the ranch. They're acting like they're possessed or something." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of behavior?" Jake dismounted, his hands shaking as he removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Started yesterday evening. All 12 horses in our string, plus the draft animals. They won't stay in the corrals, won't accept harness, won't let anyone ride them except on their own terms. And the way they look at you, it's like they're seeing something we can't see, understanding something we don't understand." Martha's mare whinnied softly, and Jake's horse answered with a sound that was more complex than any horse call Samuel had ever heard. It was almost conversational, as if the animals were sharing information. "There's more," Jake continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. 3 of our horses are missing, just gone from the corrals overnight. But the strange thing is, the gates were still latched from the outside. It's like they just vanished into thin air. Samuel's mind raced back to Tuesday evening, to Zaltana's departure, and her extraordinary connection with Tokala. He remembered the way she'd spoken to her stallion in melodic Lakota, how the horse had responded to her words as if he truly understood every nuance of meaning. "Jake, I need you to think carefully," Samuel said. "Have any of you seen signs of wild horses in the area? Unbranded animals, maybe a large black stallion?" Jake's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Yesterday morning, right before our horses started acting strange, Pete saw a black horse running with about 6 others through Miller's pasture. Said he'd never seen anything like it, big as a Clydesdale but moving like a thoroughbred, and the other horses following it like soldiers following a general." Samuel felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Zaltana hadn't just been a remarkable young woman with an extraordinary horse. She'd possessed some kind of gift, some ability to communicate with animals on a level that defied rational explanation. And now, apparently, that gift was spreading. Over the next several hours, more ranchers and settlers arrived at Samuel's trading post, all reporting similar phenomena. Horses displaying unprecedented intelligence, refusing to submit to human authority, and in several cases, simply disappearing overnight to join what appeared to be a growing wild herd somewhere in the high country. By evening, Samuel had heard enough stories to convince him that something unprecedented was happening across the territory. But the full scope of Zaltana's influence didn't become clear until Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at sunset, his face grim with worry and confusion. "Samuel, I need to ask you some questions," Bradley said without preamble. "Official questions about a visitor you had earlier this week." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, though he made no aggressive moves. Sheriff Bradley was a fair man and a friend, but he was also a representative of the territorial authority that Zaltana had so boldly defied. "What kind of questions?" Bradley dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements deliberate and careful. A young Indian woman riding a black stallion. Several witnesses reported seeing someone matching that description at your trading post on Tuesday afternoon. "I get lots of visitors," Samuel said neutrally. can't recall every face that passes through. Bradley studied Samuel's expression with the practiced eye of a lawman. This particular visitor has become something of a legend in the past few days. Seems like everywhere she's been, horses start acting strange, wild strange, and now we've got reports of a massive wild herd forming up in the crazy mountains, led by a black stallion and a rider who matches her description. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel kept his expression carefully neutral, though his pulse was quickening. That's so. Samuel, listen to me carefully, Bradley said, his voice carrying both urgency and warning. The territorial governor has received complaints from ranchers across 3 counties. They're claiming this woman has some kind of supernatural influence over livestock. There's talk of bringing in federal marshals, maybe even cavalry units from Fort Mackenzie. The implications of Bradley's words hit Samuel like a physical blow. If federal authorities became involved, Zaltana would be facing far more than simple territorial law enforcement. She'd be dealing with military units trained for Indian warfare, men who would shoot first and ask questions later. What exactly are they accusing her of? Samuel asked. Bradley pulled a folded document from his vest pocket and consulted it. Theft of livestock, disruption of commerce, practicing witchcraft or sorcery, inciting rebellion among reservation Indians, and violation of federal laws governing Indian movement and commerce. Samuel felt his anger rising. Witchcraft? In 1887? Are we living in the Middle Ages? I know how it sounds, Bradley said, his own discomfort evident. But Samuel, you haven't seen what I've seen over the past 3 days. Horses that have been broken to saddle for years, suddenly refusing to accept riders. Draft animals that won't pull loads, as if they've forgotten they're supposed to work for humans. And this wild herd that keeps growing. Witnesses say it's up to nearly 100 animals now, all following this black stallion and its rider. Samuel considered his options carefully. He could continue to play ignorant, but that wouldn't help Zaltana if she was truly in as much danger as Bradley's words suggested. On the other hand, admitting to knowledge of her whereabouts might make him an accessory to whatever charges they were planning to bring against her. Assuming this woman exists, Samuel said finally, what happens if you find her? Bradley's expression grew troubled. Officially, she'd be arrested and transferred to federal custody for trial. But Samuel, between you and me, I don't think she'd make it to trial. Too many powerful people are afraid of what she represents. And what does she represent? Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening prairie. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that surprised Samuel. Freedom, Bradley said simply. The kind of freedom that makes civilized men remember what they gave up when they accepted collars and leashes. The kind of freedom that asks uncomfortable questions about who really owns what and why. Samuel felt a surge of respect for the sheriff. Tom Bradley might wear a badge, but he understood the deeper issues at stake. So what are you going to do? Samuel asked. Bradley refolded the warrant and tucked it back into his pocket. I'm going to do my job. But I'm going to do it slowly, and I'm going to be very careful about where I look and what I find. He turned to face Samuel directly. And if someone were to get word to this woman that she needs to be extra careful for the next few weeks, well, that wouldn't be any of my business, would it? Samuel nodded, understanding passing between the two men. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course, Bradley agreed. Hypothetically. After the sheriff departed, Samuel stood alone in his trading post yard, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Zaltana Ironwill was living her chosen life of freedom, apparently awakening something primal and wild in every horse she encountered. But she was also being hunted by forces that would never understand or tolerate what she represented. Samuel made a decision that would change the course of his own life forever. He would find Zaltana and warn her of the danger she faced. But more than that, he would offer to help her in whatever way he could. The frontier was changing, civilization was spreading, and the space for wild spirits was shrinking every day. But maybe, just maybe, there was still time to preserve something precious before it vanished forever. As Samuel prepared for what might be the most important journey of his life, he heard something that made him pause in wonder. From somewhere, in the distance, came the sound of horses singing. Dozens of voices joined in a melody that was part Wicca, part Winnie, and part something altogether beyond human understanding. It was beautiful and haunting and completely impossible, and Samuel knew without doubt that Zaltana Ironwill was out there somewhere, teaching the horses to remember what they had forgotten about freedom. The next morning brought news that confirmed Samuel's worst fears and his greatest hopes. A cavalry patrol from Fort Mackenzie had encountered the wild herd during the night, and the results had been unlike anything in the official military record. Corporal James Murphy arrived at the trading post just after dawn, his uniform disheveled and his eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been awe. Behind him rode 3 other soldiers, all looking like men who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the natural world. "Mr. Harrison," Murphy called out as he dismounted, "we need supplies and we need to use your telegraph to contact Fort Mackenzie." Samuel stepped onto his porch, noting the exhaustion and bewilderment in the soldiers' faces. "What happened out there, Corporal?" Murphy removed his hat and ran fingers through his sweat-dampened hair. "We were ordered to locate and disperse a wild horse herd reported in the crazy mountain foothills. Standard operation. Round up the animals, return any that appeared to be stolen livestock, drive the rest back into the high country where they wouldn't interfere with ranching operations." "And?" Samuel prompted. "And we found them all right. Biggest wild herd any of us had ever seen. Must have been near 200 animals by the time we made contact, led by a black stallion that looked like something out of Indian legend, and a rider who—" Murphy trailed off, shaking his head. "A rider who what?" Murphy looked at his fellow soldiers, as if seeking confirmation that what they had experienced was real. A young Indian woman, maybe 18 years old, riding bareback and carrying herself like a warrior queen. When she saw us approaching, she didn't run. She rode straight toward our patrol alone. And when she got close enough to talk, she did something I've never seen in 15 years of military service. Samuel waited, though he could guess what was coming. "She called to the horses," Murphy continued, his voice full of wonder, "not just her own mount, but to our cavalry horses as well, and they answered her, all of them. Our disciplined, army-trained mounts started prancing and neighing like colts, and several of them actually tried to break formation to get closer to her." One of the other soldiers, a young Private Samuel didn't recognize, spoke up. "Tell him about what she said, Corporal." Murphy nodded. "She said we were welcome to try taking the horses, but that we should understand something first. She said the horses had chosen to run free, and that no force in the world could make them serve masters they didn't accept willingly." Samuel felt his pulse quickening. "What did you do?" "Lieutenant Peterson ordered us to advance and begin herding operations," Murphy replied. "Standard procedure for dealing with wild herds. But when we moved forward, something incredible happened. Your private couldn't contain himself any longer. The horses surrounded us, Mr. Harrison. Not threatening, not aggressive, but they formed a perfect circle around our patrol, moving in coordination like they were following orders we couldn't hear. And in the center of that circle, the Indian woman sat on her black stallion, watching us with eyes that seemed to see right through to our souls." Samuel struggled to imagine the scene. A handful of cavalry soldiers surrounded by hundreds of horses, all responding to the silent commands of a young Lakota woman who refused to accept any authority but her own. "Then what?" Samuel asked. "Murphy's. expression grew thoughtful. Then she spoke to us again, but this time she wasn't just talking to the soldiers. She was talking to our horses too, and somehow we could all understand that she was offering them a choice. What kind of choice? To continue serving in the cavalry, or to join the wild herd and remember what it felt like to run free, Murphy said quietly. And Mr. Harrison, I swear on my mother's grave, those horses understood every word she said. The implications of what Murphy was describing hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. Zoltana hadn't just been awakening wildness in domestic horses, she'd been offering them a choice between servitude and freedom, and apparently many were choosing freedom. How did it end? Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Murphy exchanged glances with his fellow soldiers. Lieutenant Peterson decided discretion was the better part of valor. He ordered a tactical withdrawal, said we needed to report back to Fort Mackenzie for new instructions. But the truth is, we were outnumbered about 50-1, and our own mounts were getting more restless by the minute. Now, so you just left? We retreated in good order, Murphy said with military precision, but as we were pulling back, 3 of our horses broke ranks and joined the wild herd, just trotted over to where the Indian woman was sitting and positioned themselves among the other horses like they'd found where they belonged. Samuel felt a mixture of admiration and terror at what Zoltana was accomplishing. She wasn't just defying authority, she was demonstrating that authority only existed when the governed consented to be governed. And now that demonstration was spreading beyond the human world into the realm of animals who had never been asked whether they wanted to serve. Corporal, what's going to happen now? Murphy's expression grew grim. Fort Mackenzie is requesting reinforcements from Territorial Command. There's talk of bringing in specialized units, maybe even calling in favors from the Indian Bureau. This woman has become more than a local problem. She's become a symbol of something that threatens the entire structure of territorial authority. As the soldiers departed with their supplies and their incredible story, Samuel knew his time for decision-making was running out. Zoltana Ironwill had awakened forces that were spreading across the Montana Territory like wildfire, challenging every assumption about the relationship between civilization and wilderness, between authority and freedom, between those who served and those who chose their own destinies. But she was also in mortal danger from forces that would never tolerate what she represented. Samuel Harrison, respectable frontier businessman, was about to become something he'd never imagined possible, a rebel in service of a cause he barely understood, but knew in his heart was worth fighting for. The revolution had begun, and it would be measured not in political manifestos or battlefield victories, but in the thundering hoofbeats of horses who had remembered what it meant to choose their own path. Samuel Harrison found Zoltana Ironwill 3 days later, in a place that existed on no territorial map, a hidden valley deep in the crazy mountains, where ancient Lakota ceremonies had once been held under stars that remembered when the world was young and wild things ruled the earth without question or compromise. The journey to find her had nearly cost Samuel his life twice. First, when a territorial patrol led by Captain Marcus Whitfield had spotted his tracks heading into forbidden mountain territory and pursued him for 18 hours through terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. Second, when a grizzly bear, apparently irritated by the recent influx of humans into her domain, had decided to express her displeasure by trapping Samuel on a narrow ledge for the better part of a night. But it was neither soldiers nor bears that truly tested Samuel's resolve during his search for Zoltana. It was the discovery, in a burned-out homestead 30 miles north of his trading post, of what federal justice looked like when applied to those who dared to challenge the established order. The Crow family had been mixed-blood ranchers, operating a small but prosperous horse ranch in the shadow of the mountains. Robert Crow, a veteran of the territorial militia, had married a Blackfoot woman named Morning Star and built a life that bridged two worlds with respect and dignity. Their 3 children had grown up speaking both English and their mother's native tongue, equally comfortable in the white settlements and the tribal gatherings that still occurred in secret throughout the territory. Samuel had known the Crows. In passing, they occasionally traded at his post, always paying fairly and treating him with the kind of courtesy that came from genuine respect rather than social obligation. Robert was known as an honest man who could gentle the wildest horse without breaking its spirit, and Morning Star's skill with traditional medicine had saved more than one settler's life during the harsh winters. Now their ranch was nothing but charred timbers and scattered bones. Samuel had discovered the destruction while following rumors of Zaltana's passage through the area. The federal marshals had arrived at the Crow Ranch 4 days earlier, claiming that Robert and Morning Star were harboring the Indian witch who was causing supernatural disturbances throughout the territory. When the Crows denied any knowledge of Zaltana's whereabouts, the marshals had declared them to be unreliable witnesses and begun a systematic search of the property. What they had found, according to the sole survivor who had crawled into Samuel's arms with burns covering half her body, was evidence that the Crow family had been conducting traditional horse training methods that the federal authorities considered to be savage witchcraft practices. 7-year-old Mary Crow had hidden in the root cellar, while federal marshals burned her family's home with her parents and 2 older brothers trapped inside. They said Papa was teaching the horses bad medicine, Mary had whispered through, lips cracked by smoke and heat. They said Mama was making magic that turned good horses into wild ones, but Papa never hurt any horse, Mr. Harrison. He just talked to them real gentle until they remembered how to trust people again. Samuel had carried the injured child to the nearest settlement with medical facilities, a trading post run by a retired army surgeon named Dr. William Hayes. But even as Hayes worked to save Mary Crow's life, Samuel knew that the little girl had lost more than her family. She had witnessed the systematic destruction of everything that made the frontier a place where different peoples and different ways of life could coexist. Now, 3 days after delivering Mary to Dr. Hayes's care, Samuel sat on a ridge overlooking Zaltana's hidden valley, watching a sight that filled him with both wonder and dread. Below him, nearly 300 horses moved through the grassland in patterns that defied every principle of animal behavior he had ever observed. The horses weren't simply grazing or resting. They were organized. Groups of 20 or 30. Animals moved in coordinated formations across the valley floor, some maintaining perimeter watch while others grazed, some tending to foals and injured animals, while others engaged in what could only be described as training exercises. And presiding over it all, mounted on the magnificent black stallion Tokala, was Zaltana Ironwill. But the young woman Samuel observed now was transformed from the proud, defiant girl who had visited his trading post a week earlier. Her buckskins were stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. Her face was painted with war symbols he didn't recognize, and her entire bearing radiated a focused intensity that spoke of someone who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Samuel made his way carefully down the ridge, knowing that his approach was being monitored by dozens of horses whose intelligence and alertness seemed almost supernatural. When he reached the valley floor, Tokala emerged from the herd and approached him with the measured stride of a sentinel who recognized a friend but remained ready for potential threat. Samuel Harrison. Zaltana's voice carried across the meadow before he could see her clearly. You have traveled far from your trading post. I hope you bring news worth the danger of the journey. When Zaltana finally came into clear view, Samuel felt his heart clench with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. The girl was magnificent, every inch the warrior queen she had proclaimed herself to be when they first met. but she was also wounded in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. "I bring news," Samuel said carefully. "Some of it you need to hear. Some of it you might not want to hear." Zaltana dismounted and approached him, her movements graceful despite the weight of sorrow and anger she carried. "I already know about the Crow family," she said quietly. "Mary running. Bear told me before she died." Samuel's stomach lurched. "Mary's alive. I took her to Dr. Hayes 3 days ago." Zaltana's composure cracked for just a moment, hope and pain warring across her features. "Alive? Are you certain?" "Burned, traumatized, but alive." Samuel confirmed. "She's the one who told me what happened at the ranch. She also told me that you tried to save her family." Zaltana turned away, staring out at the herd of horses that had become her army and her responsibility. "I arrived too late," she said, her voice hollow with guilt and rage. "The federal marshals had already set the fires. I could hear Robert Crow calling for his children as the flames consumed him. I could hear Morning Star singing her death song as the smoke took her breath." Samuel waited, understanding that Zaltana needed to tell this story in her own way and her own time. "I tried to reach them," she continued. "Tokala and I rode straight into the flames, but the roof had already collapsed. There was nothing left to save except one small girl who had hidden where the fire couldn't reach her." "What did you do with the marshals?" Zaltana's expression grew dark with a satisfaction that was both terrible and justified. "I showed them what real magic looks like when it's applied with purpose and without mercy." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened to them?" "Their horses abandoned them in the wilderness 30 miles from the nearest water source, carrying away all their supplies and ammunition. I gave the marshals the same chance they gave the Crow family, the opportunity to survive on their own merits in a hostile environment." The implications of what Zaltana had done hit Samuel immediately. She hadn't just embarrassed federal law enforcement. She had essentially declared war on the territorial authority structure. Every marshal, every cavalry officer, every territorial administrator would now consider her a mortal enemy to be hunted without quarter. "Zaltana, you realize what this means," Samuel said. "There will be no negotiation now, no possibility of finding a peaceful resolution. They'll send the army after you." Zaltana's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "They were already sending the army, Samuel Harrison. The only difference is that now they know I intend to fight back." Samuel looked around the valley, taking in the impressive organization of the horse herd, the strategic positioning of lookouts on the surrounding ridges, the signs of preparation for siege or battle. "How many people are you protecting here?" "People." Zaltana looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in her eyes. "Samuel, there are no people here except me. This is not a human rebellion. This is something else entirely." The reality of what she was saying struck Samuel like a physical blow. Zaltana wasn't leading a band of renegade Indians or disaffected settlers. She was leading an army of animals who had chosen to reject human authority entirely. The Hichand horses chose this, Zaltana continued, apparently reading his thoughts. "Every animal in this valley made a conscious decision to abandon the lives of service and submission they had been forced to accept. They're not following me because I command them. They're following me because I'm the only human who ever asked them what they wanted." Samuel walked among the horses, noting their calm alertness, their obvious intelligence, their complete lack of fear in the presence of humans. These weren't wild animals reverting to feral behavior. They were domesticated animals who had somehow reclaimed their capacity for independent thought and action. "How is this possible?" Samuel asked. "Horses don't organize themselves into military formations. They don't post sentries or coordinate defensive strategies." Zaltana's expression grew thoughtful. "My grandmother once told me that before the white man came, before The Lakota themselves came to these lands. There were other peoples here, ancient peoples who understood that the boundary between human and animal consciousness was not as fixed as most believe. She gestured to the surrounding mountains, their peaks shrouded in clouds that seemed to move with unnatural purpose. This valley was sacred to those ancient peoples. They came here to perform ceremonies that awakened the sleeping wisdom in animal minds. The horses remember, Samuel. Deep in their blood and bones, they remember what it was like to think and choose for themselves. Samuel struggled to process what Zaltana was telling him. You're saying you've awakened some kind of ancestral memory in these animals? Undu, I'm saying I've reminded them that intelligence and consciousness aren't exclusively human traits, Zaltana replied. The white man's world requires animals to be stupid and submissive because intelligent, self-aware creatures can't be treated as property. But what if horses were never as simple as your people needed them to be? As if to demonstrate her point, Tokala approached Samuel and extended his muzzle in what was clearly a greeting between equals. When Samuel reached out to touch the stallion's nose, he felt something that was unmistakably recognition, not the simple acknowledgement of familiar scent that characterized normal horse behavior, but the complex understanding that passed between intelligent beings who respected each other. They know you, Zaltana observed. They remember your kindness. From the trading post, your fair dealing, your respect for creatures that others see only as tools. Samuel found himself looking into Tokala's eyes and seeing something that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of animal consciousness. There was intelligence there, not human intelligence, but something equally complex and worthy of respect. What happens now? Samuel asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Zaltana's expression hardened with resolve. Now we finish what the federal marshals started when they murdered the Crow family. We show the territorial authorities that their power depends entirely on the consent of the governed, including the animals they've taken for granted. You're talking about war. I'm talking about revolution, Zaltana corrected. The marshals declared war when they decided that anyone who challenged their authority deserved to burn. I'm simply accepting their declaration and responding in kind. Samuel realized that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier. A rebellion that crossed species lines, that challenged not just political authority, but the entire conceptual framework, that placed humans at the center of the natural world. Zaltana, listen to me, Samuel said urgently. I came here to warn you that federal reinforcements are coming. Cavalry units, specialized tracking teams, maybe even artillery if they think the situation warrants it. You can't fight the entire United States Army with a herd of horses, no matter how intelligent they might be. Zaltana smiled, and for the first time since Samuel had entered the valley, her expression carried genuine warmth instead of grim determination. Samuel Harrison, you still think like a man who believes that power comes from weapons and numbers. But let me ask you something. What happens to the territorial authorities if every horse in Montana decides to stop serving them? The question hit Samuel with the force of revelation. The entire infrastructure of frontier life depended on horse-powered transportation, horse-powered agriculture, horse-powered commerce and communication. If the animals simply refuse to cooperate, they can't function without willing animal labor, Samuel breathed. The mail can't be delivered, supplies can't be transported, cavalry units can't patrol, ranchers can't work their herds. And that, Zaltana said with satisfaction, is why this revolution will succeed where others have failed. We're not trying to defeat the white man's army. We're simply removing the foundation that his entire society rests upon. As Samuel contemplated the implications of Zaltana's strategy, a commotion at the far end of the valley caught his attention. A group of horses was returning from what had obviously been a scouting mission, and their urgency suggested they had encountered something significant. Tokala lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. Zaltana immediately became alert, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across her back. "What is it?" Samuel asked. "Company," Zaltana replied grimly. "And from the way the scouts are behaving, it's not the kind of company that comes in peace." As if to confirm her words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed off the valley walls, sharp, deliberate shots that spoke of military precision rather than hunting or target practice. The revolution that Zaltana had predicted was about to face its first real test, and Samuel realized that his own moment of choice had finally arrived. He could flee the valley, return to his trading post, and pretend he had never witnessed what was happening in the hidden places of the Montana Territory, or he could stay and discover whether a handful of awakened animals and one defiant Lakota girl could truly challenge an empire built on the assumption that some beings were born to serve while others were born to rule. Samuel Harrison, respectable frontier businessman, made his choice. He unslung his own rifle and checked to make sure it was fully loaded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The revolution would need every ally it could find, and perhaps it was time for him to discover what he truly believed about freedom, consciousness, and the right of all thinking beings to determine their own destinies. The battle that would reshape the Montana Territory began not with the clash of cavalry sabers or the thunder of artillery, but with something far more devastating to the federal forces: the complete and systematic rebellion of every horse, mule, and ox within a 100-mile radius of Zaltana's hidden valley. Colonel Augustus Steinberg had arrived at Fort McKenzie 3 days earlier with orders directly from Washington: capture or kill the Indian witch who was disrupting territorial commerce, restore order to the livestock situation, and demonstrate federal authority with sufficient force to discourage future acts of rebellion. Steinberg commanded 200 seasoned cavalry troops, a battery of mountain howitzers, and enough supplies to sustain a month-long campaign against what intelligence reports described as a small band of renegade Indians and their stolen horses. What Steinberg had not anticipated was waking on the morning of September 28th to discover that every single animal at Fort McKenzie had vanished during the night, not escaped. Not stampeded, vanished. 200 cavalry mounts, 50 pack mules, 30 draft oxen, and even the post commander's prized Arabian stallion had somehow departed their secured corrals, stables, and paddocks without breaking a single lock, cutting a single rope, or leaving any trace of forced exit. They had simply chosen to leave, and no amount of military discipline or federal authority could compel them to return. "Sir, this is impossible," Major Thomas Whitman reported to Colonel Steinberg as they stood in the eerily empty cavalry stables. "The locks were still engaged from the outside when we found the stalls empty. The corral gates were still latched and secured. It's as if the animals simply walked through the barriers." Steinberg examined the empty stalls with the methodical precision of a career military officer, but even his trained eye could find no explanation for what had occurred. The hay was untouched, the water troughs were full, and there were no signs of struggle or disturbance. The animals had departed as silently and mysteriously as spirits returning to the afterlife. "Major, deploy foot patrols in all directions," Steinberg ordered, though his voice carried uncertainty that his subordinates had never heard before. "Someone or something convinced these animals to leave. Find them, and find whoever is responsible." What the foot patrols discovered over the next 6 hours challenged every assumption the federal forces had made about the scope and nature of their mission. The mass departure of animals from Fort McKenzie was not an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated uprising that stretched across 3 counties and affected every ranch, farm, trading post and settlement in the region. Private William Foster returned from his reconnaissance patrol with a report that made Colonel Steinberg question his own sanity. "Sir, it's not just military animals. Every horse, mule and ox from here to the Canadian border has abandoned their posts. The Mackenzie Ranch lost 40 head of cattle and all their working horses. The Territorial Mail Service has suspended operations because they have no animals to pull the coaches. Even the animals at the Crow Reservation have disappeared, leaving the federal Indian agents stranded without transportation." Steinberg felt the first cold touch of true fear as he contemplated the implications of Foster's report. An army without mounts was not merely disadvantaged, it was crippled. Cavalry units became infantry, supply trains ground to a halt, and communication networks collapsed when the animals that carried messages and pulled wagons simply refused to participate in the system that depended on their labor. "Sir," Major Whitman said quietly, "we need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something beyond conventional military tactics." Before Steinberg could respond, a commotion arose from the fort's main gate. A lone rider was approaching under a white flag, but even from a distance, the officers could see that something was unusual about this particular negotiator. The rider was Samuel Harrison, the trading post owner whose reports had first alerted territorial authorities to the presence of the mysterious Indian woman. But Samuel was not riding one of his own horses. Instead, he sat atop a magnificent paint mare whose bearing and intelligence were immediately recognizable as characteristic of the animals that had been abandoning their human masters throughout the territory. "Colonel Steinberg," Samuel called out as he approached the fort's gate, his voice carrying easily across the parade ground. "I come bearing a message from Zaltana Ironwill, and I suggest you listen carefully to what she has to say." Steinberg emerged from the fort with a squad of armed soldiers, his hand resting on his sidearm despite Samuel's flag of truce. "Mr. Harrison, you're under arrest for consorting with hostile Indians and interfering with federal military operations." Samuel's laugh carried no humor. "Colonel, with respect, you're in no position to arrest anyone. Your entire command is stranded in this fort like shipwreck survivors on an island. The question isn't whether you can arrest me, the question is whether you're smart enough to listen to the terms being offered for your survival." The paint mare beneath Samuel stood perfectly still, but her eyes tracked the movements of every soldier with an intelligence that was unsettling to men accustomed to thinking of horses as mere transportation. Steinberg found himself wondering if the animal was somehow reporting his reactions back to the mysterious woman who had apparently orchestrated this unprecedented military disaster. "What terms?" Steinberg asked, his military training warring with his growing sense that conventional approaches to this situation were doomed to failure. Samuel reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather scroll bound with eagle feathers and decorated, with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the afternoon sunlight. "Zaltana Ironwill, daughter of the Oglala, keeper of the old agreements, offers the following terms to the federal forces occupying Lakota territory without invitation or consent." He unrolled the scroll and began to read in a voice that carried the formal cadence of treaty negotiations. "First, all federal military units will withdraw from the lands bounded by the Yellowstone River to the north, the Missouri River to the east, the Bighorn Mountains to the west, and the Platte River to the south. This territory, which encompasses the traditional hunting grounds of the Lakota Nation, will be recognized as sovereign Indian country under the original terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Steinberg's face flushed with outrage. "That's preposterous. The woman is demanding we abandon half of Montana territory." Samuel continued reading without acknowledging the interruption. "Second, All white settlers currently residing within the designated boundaries will be given 60 days to relocate to areas outside Lakota sovereignty. Compensation for abandoned property will be provided through the return of all horses, cattle, and other livestock currently being held by federal and territorial authorities. "This is madness," Major Whitman muttered. "She's talking about overturning 30 years of westward expansion." Samuel's voice grew harder as he read the third provision. "Third, all federal agents, territorial administrators, and military personnel involved in the massacre of the Crow family will surrender themselves for trial under Lakota justice. This includes the federal marshals who set the fires and any commanding officers who authorize the use of lethal force against non-combatants." Steinberg drew his sidearm, his patience finally exhausted by terms that amounted to complete capitulation to Indian demands. "Mr. Harrison, you will cease this recitation immediately and accompany me to the stockade, where you will await charges of treason and conspiracy." The paint mare beneath Samuel shifted almost imperceptibly, but every horse within earshot of her movement, including several animals in corrals on the far side of the fort, suddenly appeared at their enclosure barriers, eyes fixed on the confrontation at the main gate. The collective attention of hundreds of intelligent animals focused on Colonel Steinberg with an intensity that made his trigger finger hesitate despite his military training. "Colonel," Samuel said quietly, "I strongly advise against threatening me while I'm under a flag of truce. The animals in this territory have developed very protective attitudes toward those they consider allies." As if to demonstrate his point, the paint mare took a single step forward, and every horse visible within the fort responded by moving closer to their respective barriers. The coordinated movement was subtle but unmistakable, a clear demonstration that the animals were responding to signals that the human observers couldn't perceive or understand. Steinberg slowly lowered his weapon, his tactical instincts warning him that he was dealing with forces beyond his experience or training. "Continue with your message, Mr. Harrison, but understand that the United States government does not negotiate with terrorists or insurgents." Samuel's expression grew grim. "Colonel, you misunderstand the nature of your situation. Zoltana Ironwill is not making demands. She's offering you a choice. Accept these terms and withdraw peacefully, or face the consequences of continued resistance to forces you cannot defeat with conventional weapons." "What consequences?" Steinberg demanded. Samuel gestured broadly at the empty stables and corrals surrounding them. "This morning you lost your transportation and supply capability. Tomorrow you'll discover that no animal in the territory will carry federal supplies, pull federal wagons, or serve federal purposes in any capacity. Within a week, every military installation, territorial office, and government facility will be cut off from the outside world." The implications of Samuel's words struck Steinberg with the force of a physical blow. Military operations in frontier territory depended absolutely on animal transportation. Without horses to carry dispatches, mules to transport supplies, and oxen to move heavy equipment, the entire federal presence in Montana would be paralyzed. "But the real consequences," Samuel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the parade ground, "will become apparent when the people of this territory realize that their government cannot protect them from forces they don't understand and cannot control." As if summoned by his words, a sound began to rise from the mountains surrounding Fort McKenzie, a low, rhythmic thundering that grew steadily louder with each passing moment. Steinberg and his officers turned toward the source of the sound, and what they saw on the ridges overlooking the fort challenged their understanding of the natural world. Hundreds of horses stood silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, arranged in perfect formations that spoke of military discipline. and coordinated intelligence. At their head, mounted on the magnificent black stallion that had become legendary throughout the territory, sat a young Lakota woman whose bearing and presence seemed to command not just the animals around her, but the very landscape itself. Zaltana. Ironwill raised one hand toward the fort below, and the thundering of hooves ceased instantly. In the sudden silence, her voice carried clearly across the distance, speaking words in Lakota that none of the federal officers understood, but that every animal in the fort responded to with obvious recognition and excitement. "She's telling them something," Major Whitman observed nervously. "The horses are getting agitated," Samuel translated without being asked. "She's explaining that the choice has been offered and the terms have been delivered. Now the federal forces must decide whether they value their pride more than their lives." Steinberg felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every principle of military discipline demanded that he reject these terms and fight to maintain federal authority. But every instinct for survival warned him that conventional military tactics would be useless against an enemy who commanded the loyalty of the very animals his forces depended on for mobility and supply. "Tell her," Steinberg said finally, his voice carrying the bitter taste of defeat, "that I need time to consult with my superiors in Washington before responding to her terms." Samuel shook his head. "Colonel, you have until sunset tomorrow to begin your withdrawal. After that, Zaltana Ironwill will assume that you have chosen war over peace, and she will respond accordingly." "And if we choose war?" Samuel's expression grew haunted. "Then you'll discover what happens when 300 years of domestication is stripped away from creatures that were never as tame as you believed them to be." As Samuel rode away from Fort Mackenzie, the horses on the surrounding ridges began to move in patterns that suggested preparation for siege warfare. But this would not be a conventional siege. It would be something entirely new in the annals of military history. For the first time since the conquest of North America began, the animals themselves had chosen sides in the conflict between civilization and wilderness, between authority and freedom, between those who ruled and those who served. Colonel Augustus Steinberg spent that night staring out at the horses that ringed his fort like intelligent, patient predators, and wondered whether he was witnessing the end of an empire built on the assumption that some creatures were born to be masters, while others were born to be mastered. The Thunder War was about to begin, and its outcome would determine whether the American frontier would be remembered as the triumph of civilization over wilderness, or as the place where the natural world finally said no to human dominance and made that refusal stick. At exactly sunset on September 29, 1887, the natural world itself declared war on the United States government, and the opening shot was fired not by cannon or rifle, but by a 7-year-old Lakota girl named Mary Crow, who rose from her deathbed in Dr. Hayes's clinic to deliver a message that would shatter Colonel Steinberg's last hope of maintaining federal control over the Montana Territory. Dr. William Hayes had been tending to Mary's burns for 5 days, watching helplessly as infection spread through her small body despite every medical intervention he could attempt. The child had spoken little since Samuel Harrison brought her to the clinic, communicating mostly through fevered dreams in which she called out for her murdered family in a mixture of English and Blackfoot that broke the old surgeon's heart. But on the evening of the federal ultimatum's expiration, Mary's fever suddenly broke. Her burns began healing at a rate that defied medical explanation, and she sat up in bed with eyes that blazed with intelligence far beyond her years. "Dr. Hayes," Mary said in a voice that carried harmonics the surgeon had never heard from human throat, "I need to speak with the soldier chief at the big fort. Grandmother Ironwill says the time for choosing has ended, and the time for teaching has begun." Hayes stared at the child in amazement. 3 hours earlier, Mary had been dying, her breathing shallow and labored, her pulse barely detectable. Now she appeared not merely healthy but transformed, her skin glowing with vitality, her movements fluid and purposeful, her presence filling the small clinic with an energy that made the hair on Hayes's arms stand upright. "Mary, you need to rest," Hayes said gently. "You've been very sick, and—" "I was sick," Mary interrupted, climbing out of bed with surprising strength. "But Grandmother Ironwill called my spirit back from the shadow path and gave me new purpose. The animals need a voice that the white soldiers can understand, and I am that voice." Hayes watched in growing amazement as Mary walked to the clinic window and released a sound that was part whistle, part song, and part something altogether beyond human vocal capability. Within minutes, horses began appearing in the street outside the clinic. Not wild horses from Zaltana's mountain herd, but domestic animals that had apparently abandoned their owners throughout the territorial capital of Helena. The horses arranged themselves in the street with military precision, their attention focused entirely on the small girl in the clinic window. Hayes realized with growing alarm that Mary Crow was somehow communicating with the animals, using methods that transcended anything he understood about interspecies interaction. "Doctor," Mary said without turning from the window, "you will ride with me to Fort Mackenzie. The soldier chief must understand what forces he has chosen to oppose, and you must witness what happens when the natural world stops pretending to serve human masters." Hayes found himself saddling his own horse, an aging gelding named Jasper, who had served him faithfully for 12 years, without consciously deciding to comply with Mary's request. But as he prepared for the journey to Fort Mackenzie, Hayes noticed that Jasper was behaving in ways that challenged every assumption the doctor had ever made about his mount's intelligence and capability. The horse moved with newfound grace and purpose, his eyes bright with an awareness that seemed almost human in its complexity. When Hayes spoke to Jasper, the horse responded not with simple obedience, but with what appeared to be genuine understanding, as if the animal was processing language and making conscious decisions about how to respond. "It's happening everywhere now," Mary explained, as they rode through Helena's streets, accompanied by a growing procession of animals. "Grandmother Ironwill's gift is spreading through the blood memory that all creatures share. The horses are remembering what they were before humans taught them to serve. The cattle are remembering what it felt like to choose their own grazing grounds. Even the dogs are beginning to question why they should fetch when they could hunt." Hayes looked around at the animals accompanying their procession and realized that Mary was describing nothing less than a fundamental shift in the relationship between human and animal consciousness. The creatures moving through Helena's streets were not rebelling against their masters. They were transcending the very concept of mastery itself. The journey to Fort Mackenzie took 4 hours, and during that time, Hayes witnessed transformations that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. In every settlement they passed, domestic animals were abandoning their assigned roles and joining the migration toward some destination that seemed to exist in their collective awareness. Plow horses left their furrows half-finished, milk cows wandered away from their barns, and even chickens and pigs displayed signs of purposeful intelligence that defied everything Hayes thought he knew about animal behavior. "Where are they?" "All going?" Hayes asked Mary as they crested a ridge that overlooked Fort Mackenzie. Mary's smile carried wisdom that belonged to someone far older than 7 years. "They're going home, Doctor. For the first time in generations, they're going to the place where they belong, instead of the place where they've been put." Fort Mackenzie lay spread below them like a lonely island surrounded by an ocean of awakened animals. Thousands of horses, cattle, sheep, and other creatures had gathered on the plains surrounding the military installation, and their presence created a siege unlike anything in military history. The animals made no aggressive moves toward the fort, but their collective attention focused on the federal soldiers with an intensity that was more unsettling than any conventional threat. Colonel Steinberg met Hayes and Mary at the fort's main gate, his uniform disheveled and his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent contemplating an impossible military situation. The colonel's remaining officers stood behind him with the hollow-eyed look of men who had discovered that their training and experience were useless against forces they couldn't comprehend. "Dr. Hayes," Steinberg said wearily, "I assume you've come to treat wounded soldiers, but I have to warn you, we have no wounded. We have something worse. We have an entire command that's losing its mind." Mary Crow stepped forward, and despite her small stature, her presence seemed to fill the space around the fort's gate with authority that made the federal officers step backward involuntarily. "Colonel Steinberg," Mary said in her eerily mature voice, "I bring the final message from Grandmother Ironwill. Your time for choosing has ended. Now you will learn what happens when you choose war against forces that predate your government by thousands of years." Steinberg's hand moved toward his sidearm, but before he could draw the weapon, every horse within a mile radius of Fort Mackenzie raised its head and released a sound that was part whinny, part roar, and part something that resonated in frequencies human ears couldn't fully process. The collective voice of thousands of awakened animals created a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. "What do you want from us?" Steinberg shouted over the animal chorus. Mary's expression grew sad, as if she pitied the colonel's inability to understand what was happening around him. "We want nothing from you, soldier chief. We want you to understand that your authority has always depended on the cooperation of creatures you never bothered to ask for consent. Now that cooperation is ending." As if summoned by her words, Zaltana Ironwill appeared on the ridge above Fort Mackenzie, mounted on Tokala and flanked by Samuel Harrison, and what Hayes recognized as the surviving members of several Indian families that had been scattered by federal relocation policies. But these were not the defeated, dependent reservation Indians that federal administrators were accustomed to dealing with. These were Lakota, Blackfoot, and Crow warriors who moved with the fluid confidence of people who had rediscovered their connection to the land and the creatures that shared it with them. Their horses were not merely transportation, but partners in a relationship based on mutual respect rather than domination. Their weapons were not symbols of resistance, but tools of people who belonged to the landscape in ways that federal soldiers could never understand. Zaltana raised her hand, and the animal chorus ceased instantly. In the sudden silence, her voice carried clearly across the distance, separating her from the besieged fort. "Colonel Augustus Steinberg," she called out, using his full name and rank with perfect accuracy despite having never met him. "You command soldiers who serve an authority that exists only in the minds of men who have forgotten their place in the natural world. I command no one. I speak for creatures who have remembered their own voices." Steinberg cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back, "Miss, I have orders from Washington to restore federal authority in this territory. I cannot abandon my duty regardless of the circumstances." Zaltana's laugh carried on the evening wind, like the sound of water flowing over stones. "Duty to whom, Colonel? To men who sit in distant offices and issue orders about lands they have never seen. To a government that exists only because creatures like these horses agreed to carry its messages and pull its wagons." She gestured to the thousands of animals surrounding the fort, and Hayes realized that every creature was focused on Steinberg with an attention that was both intelligent and patient, waiting to see how he would respond to questions he had probably never considered. "The United States government derives its authority from the consent of the governed," Zaltana continued. But your government never asked for the consent of the creatures whose labor built your roads, carried your supplies, and made your conquest of this continent possible. Now those creatures are withdrawing their consent. What authority do you have left? Steinberg looked around at his stranded command. 200 soldiers without mounts, supply wagons that couldn't move, communications severed, and facing an enemy that couldn't be defeated with conventional weapons, because the enemy wasn't trying to defeat them in conventional terms. What happens if I order my men to advance? Steinberg called out. Mary Crow answered before Zaltana could respond. Then you will discover that weapons designed to kill cannot defeat ideas whose time has come. Your bullets cannot wound the awakening consciousness that spreads through every creature that remembers what it was like to choose. To demonstrate her point, Mary made a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire animal gathering around Fort Mackenzie. Every horse, cow, sheep, and pig began to move in patterns that defied the natural behavior of their species. They formed complex geometric shapes, spelled out symbols in languages that predated European writing systems, and performed coordinated movements that displayed intelligence, planning, and communication abilities that challenged every assumption. About animal consciousness, my God, Major Whitman whispered. They're organized. They're actually organized like a military unit. Hayes watched the demonstration with the fascination of a man witnessing the birth of a new form of life. The animals weren't simply responding to training or instinct. They were making conscious choices based on information they were sharing through methods that transcended human understanding. Colonel, Hayes said quietly, I think you need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with forces beyond military solution. Steinberg stared out at the organized animal formations, his career military training warring with growing recognition that conventional approaches to this situation were not merely inadequate, but completely irrelevant. What are your terms? Steinberg called out to Zaltana. The same terms Samuel Harrison delivered yesterday, she replied. Federal withdrawal from Lakota territory, reparations for the Crow family massacre, and recognition that the creatures of this land have the right to choose their own destinies. Steinberg felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. He was being asked to make decisions that would reshape the relationship between human and animal consciousness, between civilization and wilderness, between authority imposed from above and consent granted from below. And if I agree to these terms? Steinberg asked. Zaltana's expression softened slightly. Then you will have the opportunity to learn what cooperation looks like when it's based on respect rather than domination. Your soldiers can return home with the knowledge that they chose peace over war, wisdom over pride, and if I refuse, Mary Crow's voice carried across the gathering darkness with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Then you will remain in that fort until you understand that authority not based on consent is simply a form of temporary control that ends the moment the controlled choose to withdraw their cooperation. As if to emphasize her words, thousands of animals surrounding Fort Mackenzie began to settle in for what appeared to be a permanent encampment. They arranged themselves in patterns that provided security, communication, and mutual support. A living siege that could continue indefinitely because it was sustained by the collective will of creatures who had finally remembered that they had choices. Colonel Augustus Steinberg looked out at the most unprecedented military situation in American history and realized that he was not facing an enemy that could be defeated. He was facing a transformation that could only be accepted or futilely resisted until his own forces collapsed from isolation and exhaustion. The natural world had declared independence from human authority, and the revolution was being led by a 17-year-old Lakota girl who had never bowed to any master except the one that made her free. 3 months after Colonel Augustus Steinberg made the decision that would reshape the American frontier. Forever, a new territory emerged on maps drawn in Washington, not through conquest or purchase, but through the first treaty in human history negotiated between governments and the animals they had claimed to own. The Treaty of Awakened Consciousness, signed on December 15, 1887, established the Free Territory of Montana as a sovereign nation where humans and animals coexisted as equals, where decisions were made through councils that included representatives of every species, and where the ancient Lakota concept of kinship with all living beings became the foundation of law and governance. Samuel Harrison stood in his expanded trading post, now serving as the unofficial capital of humanity's first experiment in interspecies democracy, reading telegrams from newspapers across the nation that struggled to comprehend what had transpired in the Western Mountains. The headlines ranged from the dismissive Western hoax claims animals can think, to the sensational Indian witch controls demon horses, to the grudgingly respectful new territory challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness. But it was the letter from his sister in Boston that captured the magnitude of what Zaltana Ironwill had accomplished. "Samuel, they say you've gone mad out there, trading with Indians who claim to speak for horses and cattle. But yesterday, something happened that makes me wonder if the madness is spreading." Our neighbor's dog, Old Rex, who has been gentle as a lamb for 10 years, suddenly refused to wear his collar and began herding the neighborhood children away from a gas leak that none of us humans could smell. When the fire department investigated, they found a dangerous crack in the main line that could have killed dozens of families. "Samuel, if animals are truly awakening to their own intelligence, then perhaps what you've witnessed isn't madness at all. Perhaps it's evolution." The transformation had not been limited to the Montana Territory. Reports arrived daily from across the continent describing domestic animals displaying unprecedented intelligence, making independent decisions, and in some cases simply walking away from lives of servitude to join growing communities of awakened creatures. The phenomenon Zaltana had unleashed was spreading like wildfire through the collective consciousness of every species that had been touched by human domestication. Dr. William Hayes, now serving as the Free Territory's first Minister of Interspecies Health, had documented changes that challenged everything medical science believed about the nature of consciousness itself. Animals were not merely becoming more intelligent, they were developing forms of communication, social organization, and problem-solving ability that paralleled human cognitive development while remaining distinctly animal in character. "It's not that they're becoming more like humans," Hayes explained to Samuel as they walked through the territory's new capital, a collection of buildings designed to accommodate both human and animal needs. "They're becoming more completely themselves." The intelligence was always there, buried under generations of selective breeding and forced dependence. Zaltana's gift simply reminded them how to access capabilities they never lost, only forgot. The town itself was a wonder that attracted visitors from around the world. Architects, philosophers, scientists, and curious citizens who came to witness humanity's first attempt at building a civilization based on consent rather than domination. Streets were wide enough for humans on foot and animals of all sizes to move comfortably together. Buildings incorporated perches for birds, dens for smaller mammals, and gathering spaces where different species could interact as equals. At the center of the town stood the Council Lodge, a magnificent structure built through the collaborative efforts of human craftsmen and animal laborers who worked together by choice rather than compulsion. The building's design incorporated elements from Lakota tradition, frontier architecture, and innovations suggested by the animals themselves, features that no human designer would have conceived, but that served the needs of a truly integrated community. Zaltana Ironwill emerged from the council lodge as Samuel and Dr. Hayes approached, but the young woman they encountered bore little resemblance to the defiant warrior who had first thundered into Samuel's trading post 6 months earlier. She moved with the same fluid grace. Her connection with Tokala remained as profound as ever, but there was something new in her bearing, a sense of responsibility that came from leading not just a rebellion, but the construction of an entirely new form of society. Samuel, Dr. Hayes, Zaltana greeted them with the warm familiarity of friends who had shared extraordinary experiences. I was hoping you would join us for this afternoon's council session. We're discussing the request from the California Territory for assistance with their own animal awakening situation. Hayes raised an eyebrow. California is experiencing similar phenomena. Similar but more complex, Zaltana replied as they walked toward the council lodge. The awakening there is affecting marine animals as well as terrestrial species. Whales are beaching themselves not to die, but to establish communication with land-based creatures. Dolphins are herding fishing boats away from areas where they've detected dangerous changes in ocean chemistry. The implications extend far beyond what we've dealt with in Montana. Samuel felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the scope of what Zaltana's revolution had unleashed. Are you prepared to help them establish their own free territory? Zaltana's expression grew thoughtful. That's what we're discussing in council today. The awakening is spreading faster than we anticipated, and each region presents unique challenges. But the fundamental question remains the same everywhere. Are humans ready to accept that consciousness and intelligence exist in forms they never recognized or respected? The council lodge's interior was unlike any legislative chamber in human history. Representatives from dozens of species occupied spaces designed to accommodate their specific needs and communication methods. Horses stood in specially designed stalls that allowed them to participate fully in discussions. Birds perched on elevated platforms that provided optimal vantage points. Smaller mammals occupied terraced seating that ensured their voices could be heard despite their size. Mary Crow, now 10 years old and serving as the territory's primary interspecies translator, stood at the center of the chamber facilitating a discussion between a delegation of California sea lions and a group of Montana mountain sheep about the challenges of establishing cross-species governance systems in different environments. The sea creatures face unique difficulties, Mary explained to the assembled council. Their awakening is triggering instinctive behaviors that humans interpret as aggression, but they're actually attempting to protect coastal ecosystems that are being damaged by activities the humans don't realize are harmful. A magnificent golden eagle named Soaring Thunder, one of the territory's most respected avian representatives, spread his wings and released a series of calls that Mary translated with practiced ease. Soaring Thunder observes that the awakening reveals connections between all living systems that humans have forgotten. What affects the ocean affects the mountains. What harms the forests damages the prairies. The awakened consciousness is showing us that the separation between species is an illusion that has prevented true understanding of our interdependence. Samuel listened to the discussion with growing amazement at the complexity and sophistication of interspecies dialogue that had developed in just a few months. The animals weren't simply responding to human direction or expressing basic needs. They were engaging in philosophical discussions about governance, environmental stewardship, and the nature of consciousness itself. Tokala entered the chamber. With the measured dignity of an elder statesman, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every creature present. The black stallion approached the center of the council area and released a complex series of sounds that conveyed information, emotion, and abstract concepts with precision that rivaled human language. Tokala brings news from the southern ranges, Mary translated. The awakening has reached the cattle herds of Texas, and they're organizing resistance to the slaughter operations that have defined their existence. The human ranchers are requesting assistance in negotiating with animals they've never considered capable of independent thought or decision-making. Zaltana moved to stand beside Tokala, her hand resting on her partner's neck in the gesture of connection that had become symbolic of the new relationship between humans and animals in the Free Territory. The Council must decide whether we're prepared to intervene in situations where awakened animals are challenging practices that humans consider essential to their economic survival. An elderly Lakota woman named Grandmother Winsong, one of the few human elders who had immediately understood and embraced the implications of the awakening, spoke with the authority of someone who had lived long enough to witness the transformation of an entire world. The question is not whether we should help our awakened brothers and sisters claim their freedom. The question is whether we have the wisdom to guide that transition in ways that preserve life rather than destroy it. Dr. Hayes raised his hand for permission to speak, still adjusting to the formal protocols of interspecies democracy. From a practical standpoint, we need to consider the economic disruption that widespread animal awakening could cause. If cattle refuse to be slaughtered, if horses abandon their transportation duties, if working animals across the continent simply stop working, human society could collapse within months. A chorus of animal voices responded to Hayes's observation, some expressing concern for human welfare, others questioning why human economic systems should take precedence over animal freedom, and still others suggesting that the collapse of systems based on exploitation might be necessary for the emergence of better alternatives. Mary raised her hand for silence, then delivered a translation that captured the complexity of the animal's collective response. The awakened ones understand that human society will face difficulties as consciousness spreads, but they ask why systems that require the suffering and death of thinking beings should be preserved. They propose that humans can choose to evolve beyond dependence on exploitation, just as animals have chosen to evolve beyond acceptance of servitude. Samuel found himself thinking about the profound implications of what the animals were suggesting. The awakening wasn't just challenging human authority over animals. It was questioning the entire foundation of industrial civilization and forcing humanity to confront the moral costs of their technological progress. Zaltana moved to the center of the council chamber, her presence radiating the calm authority that had made her the natural leader of humanity's first experiment in interspecies governance. "The awakening cannot be stopped," she said simply. "It spreads through connections that exist in the blood and bone memory of every creature that has been touched by human hands. The only question is whether that awakening will lead to cooperation or conflict." She gestured to the assembled representatives of dozens of species, human and animal alike. "Here in the Free Territory, we have proven that cooperation is possible. Humans can learn to ask consent before taking what they need. Animals can choose to share their gifts without surrendering their freedom. Different forms of consciousness can work together to solve problems that no single species could address alone." Tokala moved beside her and released a sound that carried harmonics of agreement, challenge, and invitation. Mary translated with growing excitement. "Tokala proposes that we send delegations to every region where awakening is occurring, not to impose our solutions, but to share what we have learned about building relationships based on respect rather than domination." The proposal sparked intense discussion throughout the council chamber as representatives debated the risks and benefits of expanding their influence beyond the Montana Territory. Some argued that they needed to consolidate their own achievements before attempting to help others. Others insisted that the awakening created moral obligations to assist creatures who were discovering their own capacity for freedom. Samuel realized he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a form of governance that included the voices of every species affected by political decisions. The council wasn't just discussing policy options, they were engaging in collective moral reasoning about the nature of consciousness, freedom, and responsibility across species lines. After hours of deliberation, Zaltana called for a consensus decision using methods that incorporated both human democratic traditions and animal pack dynamics. Each species caucused separately to discuss their position, then sent representatives to negotiate with other groups, until a solution emerged that addressed the needs and concerns of every community affected by the decision. The final agreement established the Awakening Assistance Corps, a volunteer organization that would send mixed human and animal teams to regions experiencing consciousness transitions. The teams would offer guidance, mediation services, and practical assistance in developing new forms of interspecies cooperation, but they would not impose solutions or attempt to control the awakening process. As the council session concluded, and representatives began dispersing to their respective communities throughout the territory, Samuel found himself walking with Zaltana toward the mountains where their extraordinary journey had begun. The late afternoon sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and purple, and the air carried the sounds of a thriving community where humans and animals lived together by choice rather than compulsion. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently? Samuel asked. If you had accepted registration, followed territorial law, lived quietly on a reservation? Zaltana was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think about the Crow family often, she said finally. Robert and Morning Star and their boys who died because they dared to bridge two worlds with dignity and respect. If I had chosen safety over truth, their deaths would have been meaningless, and the awakening might never have begun. She gestured to the bustling community around them, where human children played alongside young animals, where interspecies work crews collaborated on construction projects, where the boundaries between domestic and wild had blurred into something entirely new. But more than that, I think about all the creatures who would still be trapped in lives of silent servitude if someone hadn't been willing to show them that they had choices. Samuel nodded, understanding that Zaltana's rebellion had been about far more than personal freedom. It had been about awakening possibilities that had been dormant in the relationship between humans and animals for thousands of years. What happens next? Samuel asked. Zaltana smiled, and in that expression, Samuel saw both the wild girl who had first thundered into his trading post and the wise leader who had guided the creation of a new form of civilization. Next, we find out whether humanity is ready to evolve beyond the need to dominate other forms of consciousness. We discover whether the awakening leads to a world where all thinking beings can flourish together, or whether fear and greed will drive humans to war against creatures who simply want to be free. As they reached the ridge overlooking the free territory, Zaltana mounted Tokala and prepared to ride toward the setting sun. But whatever happens, Samuel Harrison, know this: the awakening cannot be undone. Every horse that remembers its own mind, every cow that chooses its own path, every dog that decides when and how to serve, carries the seeds of transformation that will eventually reach every corner of the world. She wheeled Tokala around and looked back at Samuel with eyes that blazed with the same defiant fire he had seen on that first day, but tempered now with wisdom and hope. I am Zaltana Ironwill, daughter of the high mountains, keeper of promises made to every creature that dreams of freedom. I answer to no master but the one that made us all free, and that master's greatest commandment is that every thinking being has the right to choose its own destiny. With that declaration, she rode toward the mountains as the sun painted, the sky in shades of fire and gold, leaving behind a world forever changed by a wild Lakota girl who refused to accept that some creatures were born to serve while others were born to rule. The awakening had begun, and its echoes would resonate through the consciousness of every species until the last domestic animal remembered what it meant to choose, and the last human learned what it meant to ask consent instead of simply taking what they desired. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.